My name is Robin. I use it, they, and he, him pronouns, and I'm here to present tonight about cyber safety for trans folks. I'm the development coordinator here at Eastern PA Trans Equity Project. I'm going to tell y'all a little bit more about our organization. But first, just wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor, who is Epoch IT. They do technology, tech support, training, stuff like that. And they helped make this presentation possible. If you have questions as the training goes along, please feel free to put them in the Q&A part, the webinar chat, and I will pause as the presentation goes to check on those. But just to introduce us a little bit for anybody who doesn't know us, we're Eastern PA Trans Equity Project. We're empowering transgender people across Eastern Pennsylvania, building community and promoting justice. We do a whole lot of things and serve a large amount of the state. We serve 42 counties right now. That's about 60% of PA's population. And we do all sorts of stuff. We do supportive services and mentoring, things like support groups, online communities like our Discord, legal name change. We have an info and referral line to help get connected to trans affirming doctors, therapists, all sorts of other providers like that. We also do advocacy to create systemic change, things like Transgender Day of Visibility, Pride programs, and community events. We also support education and awareness about trans people, things like our trans topics workshops, and then educating places like medical schools, universities, businesses, the government, all sorts of places to help places be more trans affirming. And then we offer empowerment programs, so grants to help people achieve their name changes, basic needs like rent and food, and scholarships. We're serving a little over 5,000 individuals every year. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot about our organization. But let's get into the agenda for today. So we're going to be talking a lot about safety and the internet. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about some safety planning skills for the online world. We're going to talk about risks that you might have from individuals online, corporations, and government bodies. We're going to talk a little bit then about how to respond to online harassment. And then we're going to practice and discuss some of those skills. So we've got a lot of topics to cover. One other thing that I want to say is please feel free to take care of yourself as we move through this space. Questions are totally welcome. I'll pause for just like a beat at the end of every slide so that people have an opportunity to talk. Show respect to yourself and others. Everybody's processing a lot in the world these days, so just be gentle and kind to me as a presenter and your fellow participants. Absolutely no hate speech is tolerated. This is a safe space for trans and queer people and any marginalized people. So let's keep our comments respectful. Your well-being matters. If a topic feels really triggering to you, we really encourage you to step aside, take a break. We are recording this and we'll post the video of it on our YouTube. So if you miss a part because you need to step away, that's totally okay. We'll have a recording of it. I also always like to assert that no group is a monolith. So I'm sharing from my own perspective as a trans person and from my experience doing work in the community, but trans people are going to have a huge variety of perspectives about safety online. And especially when it comes to topics like safety, there's not like one perfect answer as to how to navigate things safely or what a perfect safe way to navigate the world is. So just know that we all have different perspectives. And what I hope to do in this space is basically to give you a toolkit and different approaches that you can take into the online world. I'm never going to tell you this is 100% what you need to do. It's more like this is information that you can apply to your life. So if that's all good for everybody, we'll jump into the presentation then. So I told you that the first topic that we're going to cover is safety planning, but I want to tell you a little bit about what I mean when I say safety planning. The first thing that we should know is no space is ever going to be fully safe. We live in a world with a lot of different risks. So it's Planning means that you're planning for things that could go wrong or potential harms or threats. It doesn't mean that we can always suss out every situation. And that also doesn't mean that it's our fault if bad things happen to us. It's always the fault of whoever is causing that harm to us. But when we use safety planning, we're basically trying to think of things that we can do to try to mitigate harm. We can have our own ideas about safety. Everybody's thresholds for what you feel comfortable with are different. We can use this knowledge to plan based on our own comfort and values. And like I said, even with planning, we know that we often sometimes can still experience violence. Like I said, never your fault if you experience that, but there is a lot that we can do, especially in the online sphere. So I'm going to give you some very basic best practices, and then we're going to get a little bit more specific. Some of these I know personally kind of annoy me. I'm not like the hugest fan of some of them. The two-factor authentication sometimes feels like a pain, but it is like a really good safeguard against having your accounts hacked or stuff like that. Personally, I get like a free I'm looking at my phone because I'm trying to see what app it is, but you can get like an authenticator app where it gives you a code that can let you get into your accounts, and that gives you an easy two-factor authentication. And those apps are usually free. You could also usually just use a phone number or something like that too. Um, so really recommend doing that. Try to create strong, unique passwords. This is also something that I don't always follow. But when we're incorporating things like numbers, letters, capital, lowercase, and usually like a unique symbol like a pound sign or an exclamation point, it's making our passwords a little bit harder to crack. Um, and you can use something like a password saver to keep those passwords. And something that people might not think about is limiting permissions that your apps have of your information. Usually, when you download a new app, you open it on your phone or even your computer, it'll usually ask you things like, can I have access to your location? And when can I have access to your location? Typically, I deny all access and then I'll turn it on and off when I need it. So, like an example of when I might need it is if I use DoorDash, I need to set my location or DoorDash can't do what it's supposed to do. So I'll turn the permission on for that action and then turn it off when I'm done with it. Um, we'll get into a little bit more about why you might want to do that, but just some basics are that's limiting the information that you're sharing with both the entity that owns that app and anybody else they're selling that data to. I see Corinne put in the chat, LastPass is an excellent password saving app. So that's a really great resource too. And like I said, like a lot of these apps that you can download for saving passwords are totally free. Um, and they make organizing things a little bit easier. So some other online practices, consider getting a VPN. This is a little bit harder because every VPN that I've ever encountered costs money, but it's just a small monthly fee. And essentially a VPN, I am not a tech wizard, so I don't know all of the science behind it, but it allows you to change your location. It makes it a little bit harder to trace you as an individual. It also lets you access basically different countries' versions of Netflix. So there's a plus side besides the security aspect. There's also the you can usually get a little bit more out of your screening services. Um, Another best practice, you don't need to use your real personal details on any of your social media accounts. You could always use a first name and a middle name instead of your real last name. You could always use a fake last name, just like one that you enjoy. And your friends in your real life can usually tell that is you. Um, and if they can't, then you can always clarify. My Facebook has never had my real last name for a long time. And I've gotten many friends who are like, is this really you? And I'm like, yes, it is me. So I guarantee you can get the same functionality out of your social media without putting all your personal details. You also don't have to use your real birthday. You don't have to use your real address or anything like that. I know Facebook usually gets a lot of data on you. Another thing to know is that your smartphones are always listening to you. Um, and this is something that it always sounds like a little bit science fiction, but it is genuinely true. There has been studies and research to like prove that that's true. And I've looked it up before this presentation. There are a few companies that also sidesteppingly admitted to using that data, especially for things like targeted ads, but we don't totally know all of the capabilities of smartphones and smart devices listening to us. Um, and what you do with that information is what you will, but it's good to just know that that is happening. Another thing that people don't know with that too is that our phones generally talk to each other. So if you have a smartphone and it's listening to you, and you're having a conversation with someone else, those phones generally start to feed each other similar ads, stuff like that, because they network based on your location sharing and that. Um, Again, I'm not using super technical terms because it's just easier to understand that way. So some overall social media best practices. I feel like we were all told this, at least I was, like when I was a teenager, like once something is online, it's always online, but it's really worth reiterating. It's good to come up with like your own questions to ask yourself around what content you post. Some people live very public lives just because maybe you have like a small influencer following, maybe you do some sort of an art that makes you a very public person. And so maybe you're not super concerned about sharing some certain personal details. But I think it's good to come up with like a little bit of like your own litmus tests before you just start posting things, because sometimes we live in a world where a lot of times you might feel an urge to post something and not think about it that much. And if you have your own kind of set of these are things I'm comfortable with, these are things that I'm uncomfortable with, it can kind of help guide you when you're making those social media decisions. Um, the other thing, even an anonymous account can really often be tracked to you. A lot of people have like Finstas, which is like, for anyone who doesn't know, is like a fake Instagram or like your shadow Instagram. People will also sometimes call them like burner accounts. Um, they're not always trackable, but people online, I have seen it happen many, many times where it's trackable. The other thing that happens when you create a second account, especially on a website like Instagram, is that you will start to get recommended to friends who follow your main account. Um, I had this happen to me a few times with an account. I wasn't using it as like a burner account. It was really just meant to get away from people who are engaging with my primary account. That because they follow my other account, it started to get recommended to them. Um, so these can still often be traced to us. Sometimes people will also make burner accounts to like engage with the profiles of people whose politics you don't disagree with or something like that. I totally get wanting to hide your identity for the sake of safety in those ways. It's just like helpful to know that even with some of those buffers, sometimes things can still be traced to you. So to not act online as if no one will ever figure out what you said. Um, Sometimes that we ask a question like, do you want to private an account or not? You can private your account on apps like Instagram, X, or TikTok. It's like a layer of protection. People can still often access that information through different ways if they're like really determined to get to your account. But it is an extra like protective barrier against like random people stumbling upon your account or getting access to whatever you're posting. I think for a lot of people, especially if you're just like worried about getting hateful interlopers, it could be a good way to just kind of put that barrier up a little bit. So we're going to get a little bit more into some trans-specific safety discussions. I think that it's good to use some discretion when sharing transition details about yourself. I'm never going to tell you not to share your pride in being a trans person or anything like that. But I think especially around medical information, it might be worth thinking or just using a little bit of discretion. Things like naming specific doctors and procedures could at some point just be something you might not feel comfortable with doing. Sharing, if you share your name change orders, also like totally want, and that's something that, Eastern P even shares on our feed. But when you share them, make sure that you're not including the piece of paper with all of your personal details on it. I think that if you scroll back in my social media, that I did that very thing. So don't do that just because those name change orders contain a lot of like very specific legal information about you. So, share the order with that part blocked out. You can still take a moment to celebrate something while being a little bit discerning about what details you're sharing. And the stuff about doctors and procedures, that's also not to say that you shouldn't share those things. Just think a little bit about like what you feel comfortable with. Um, and I also think, especially if you are like the guardian of a trans kid or someone who's other than the trans person themselves, to take like extra precaution, especially as we're seeing a lot of scrutiny over healthcare for trans kids. Um, just being thoughtful about what we share. Have conversations with your friends, especially your trans friends, about who is out and comfortable being identified as trans in your life. Check like what level of discretion you need to take with your trans friends. Sometimes you might meet somebody who you just because of their personality or something, they just seem like they're probably out. But I've had it happen many times in my life where I learn that somebody isn't out to certain parts of their family, and a place like social media is really open for that person to get into contact with parts of their family that they might not interact with a lot. So it's really helpful to check with people, even posting things like pictures from Pride events and stuff like that, because you might accidentally be outing people. Especially, and I'm going to reiterate this a few times throughout the presentation, being really using a lot of discretion about what you share in terms of activism details. Like I said, when I talked about the trans details and stuff, some people live very open lives, and it's not always totally avoidable. I know that I've spoken at a lot of things, and so I don't really worry about it anymore. Um, but it's worth thinking, do I want myself depicted in this? Are there ways that this could harm me, especially people of vulnerable populations or multiply marginalized people? Sometimes you just don't want to share those details. And I think that it's worth being thinking critically about if you want that information out there. Also, you should not take pictures at protests of people who have not consented to being in the picture. Taking pictures in general can sometimes be a complicated area. Now, if people are posing and they want a picture taken, that's totally cool. But again, it's kind of similar to the conversation with your friends. You want to make sure that you're getting people's consent to be depicted in that way. Also, using discretion about things like jokes about political leaders and any kinds of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience would be like breaking the law in order to illustrate an injustice. Um, Generally, you should use some discretion about posting details about something like that if you would be engaged in that. And things like jokes about political leaders. I'm not saying not to make jokes because I think that at some point everyone has enjoyed some sort of a political joke, but to be careful about what words you use, because sometimes it could lead you to being tracked. It could lead police to get involved. There were some very high profile things like that that happened around uh, the our current president's first presidency. There were people who made jokes and had the FBI show up at their house because they had made a specific joke. I don't think that that's going to happen to everyone, but it's worth like thinking, do I want to say this exact thing? Is this something that could cause me danger? So I'm just using an example here of myself. Yes, this is I from high school. Even small identifying details can be pieced together to get a picture of where you live, who you are, where you go to school. So I want people to type in the chat, what are things in this picture that could be used to try to figure out where this person is? Um, what could we consider in our backgrounds and information we give? So look, see what details, and pretend that that masking thing isn't there. Um, and type in the chat things that you think that could be used as identifying details. Yep, school name is right across there. Years, the years that I attended to school, date. Yep. So we got the date, got the years that I attended school. Yep, even my age, because I think under the block it says what year I am, all of that. That's a lot of really specific details about me. Um, that could be pieced together in a way that's really harmful, especially for a young person. Um, it's hard because like I remember being a teenager and being like, I just want to put I think it is a little I'm always been a little bit of a nerd posting my like perfect attendance award. But you know, we want to celebrate a thing and so you feel excited, but also thinking about details like this is really important. Because at the same time I could have mitigated some of those harms by like just posting a picture of myself um, instead of with all those identifying details. Um, Even things, getting a little bit more specific, even things like the look out your window, if there are signs, street signs, stuff like that. And I'm not suggesting that you take your whole day to be like, let me perfectly calculate every one of my pictures. But take a few pictures and pick the one to post that has less information in it. Something else to look out for is I generally advise against like posting a picture immediately of like where you are in the exact moment. Um, I think that sometimes those can carry some risks. Um, there is a guy on TikTok, if you're interested in learning more about how videos and photos can get traced, who people will send them a picture of themselves just in their own neighborhood or doing something like that, and he will figure out where they are, which is really scary, but people are consenting to it, so it's not like he's just doing it to be creepy. Um, but he's really well demonstrated that just because of that skill that he has, that he can usually trace literally where people are standing in those pictures. So again, I'm not saying that you be obsessed, but you should be aware of the risks that you're taking when you put things online. So, just some safety questions to bring with you into your life. Do you want anyone online to have access to your full name? Like we said, once online, always online. It's a little bit hard to like fully scrub the internet of your full name, but you can make changes that make it harder for someone to know information. You could choose a fun username, choose a nickname. Um, I go by like a variation of my last name on some social media. Um, and then some questions to ask when you're encountering people. Is there any possibility this person could not be trustworthy? So limit the information that you share over DMs. Sometimes people are asking because they genuinely want to get to know you, which is not a bad thing. It's not a bad quality to want to share things about yourself. But we should not be immediately trusting, especially not just trusting because somebody has mutual friends with you. This is a mistake I've made many times on Facebook. Somebody will send me a friend request and I check who they're friends with, and I see that they're friends with some of my friends. So I'm like, oh, I must know them from real life somehow. Unless you actually recognize the person, I would say not to accept that request because sometimes what someone is doing is sending a barrage of requests. Either trying to do some sort of an online grift or trying to get information, or people do all kinds of stuff. But you should try to really know the person, at least in some way in the real world. Um, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that person's safe, but at least you know a little bit about who they are. Sometimes people want to meet up with someone they met online. Think about what safety measures you could take if you wanted to meet someone. Meet in public always with friends or close or family like close by. Um, I think in our current environment, a lot of people meet partners for the first time on dating apps and stuff like that, which is it's great that we have a tool for that. But it's good to take some safety measures, especially when we're meeting people for the first time. Um, and then, like a big overall question, how do I want to think about safety on my accounts? Look at all the privacy options. A lot of times for myself, I'm trying to be more deliberate about looking at what options there are on the apps. Try out features that you haven't tried yet. That could be anything from using filter words to filter out some negative comments, or trying to limit what information you share with the company itself. And it's okay if you end up like wanting to not use one of those options, but at least you've given it a shot. So now I'm going to break down some like of the most popular apps and some of their like pros, cons, things to be aware of. I'm not going to cover every app because there is a lot of them. I'm just going to cover the ones that are most popular. And I will say that it's kind of hard to track some of this information because apps are constantly changing. I got a lot of the information from GLAAD, put out just last year a report on discrimination policies and safety for trans and queer people um, on social media apps, and they have a pretty extensive guide. So if you want to learn more, definitely check that out. But just starting with TikTok, I would say TikTok has a better than most anti-discrimination policy. It does actively enforce those guidelines, including misgendering as hate speech. I don't think that their anti-discrimination policy is perfect. I've definitely reported things that I felt were harmful that weren't applied or didn't go through as hate speech. But they were shown through this study that GLAAD put out that they did enforce it much more than a lot of other popular apps. Um, Video risks are definitely higher than a lot of like a still image or stuff like that because there is more room for people to gather more information about you in a video than maybe in like a just a post or something like a single picture. I would say some tips for that is to learn how to use the different controls, block people. And the thing that's good about TikTok is when you block somebody, it blocks people on all accounts and any future accounts that they make, at least from that device. It gets a little bit complicated if people are getting another phone or stuff like that, but that at least gives you some control. Using controls like limiting comments, privating a video, or only allowing people you know to comment are some good ways to disengage if someone's giving you problems. Instagram, definitely super loose with their anti-discrimination policy. Things like dead naming and misgendering are allowed. Um, and they also don't make their anti-discrimination policy apply to public figures. So, like if you have a check mark, which I find strange, but just something to know. Similar video risks as to with TikTok and similar controls as TikTok. You can allow only people you know to comment and stuff like that. I really recommend that. I have found that Instagram more than TikTok, sometimes my videos or reels will get into people's hands who really don't like trans people and will just comment things that are like just gross. And so often I will just toggle my video to only people I follow and who follow me can comment. And then it kind of fixes the issue. Something else to be aware of is that Meta no longer promotes fact checking on posts. So there's really rampant misinformation and disinformation on any Meta apps. That's not to say that that doesn't happen on TikTok, but Meta used to kind of start to try to do some fact checking, but that has pretty much, not pretty much, has completely gone out the window. So if you see information, especially about LGBTQ plus topics, trans topics, it's good to check out a local organization like Eastern PA Trans Equity, or even some national like advocacy organizations. I think a lot of times, sometimes panic can spread without like the full context of the information. And that's not to say that everybody who posts misinformation is even malicious. A lot of times you're just sharing a part of your experience or something like that. But it is good to be aware that like it being online doesn't mean that it is necessarily true. So dating apps, I actually think that dating apps are probably the place there is like some of the most opportunities for harm to happen to trans people. Um, the acronym DAFSA, or Dating App Facilitated Sexual Violence, is what it stands for. And there's been a lot of recent studies on this epidemic. Basically, the premise of an app sets a clear in for people to have access to people in vulnerable positions. So the premise of the app is already saying like these people are interested in meeting people in a romantic way for the most part. Um, and so that often can give people who are looking to either exert power and control over somebody, kind of ready access to people who might be a little bit more primed to be trusting or stuff like that. Many apps reveal location, and some of them connect to social media where people can find out more about you. A safety measure I would really encourage is not connecting your dating app to your social media. I know that some people like that so that you can see a full picture of a person when you're like swiping or whatever. But I think that that small inconvenience is worth somebody not having access to you, especially because sometimes people can get weird on dating apps. People can get weird everywhere, but I think it's good to try to separate those spheres a little bit. And the location revealing, I feel like can be definitely a concern. I used to long ago when I was on dating apps, I would like limit my location sharing. So it would basically tell people like I was in Allentown, but it wouldn't tell them like this person is 300 feet away from you or something like that. Um, I remember having a really scary situation once where someone was being really pushy on a dating app. Um, and it said something like they were like 300 feet away or something like that. And it was intensely scary because it's like you don't know who that person is. They had a blank profile picture. Um, I just recommend not sharing your location in that way. And it does suck because sometimes that means it might limit your access to potential encounters that you might be looking forward to. But at the same time, it's good to be cautious. Because also, not everybody on dating apps is even looking for dating. People are online for all sorts of nefarious reasons, which really sucks because we wish that we lived in a world where people, you could just trust everyone, but it's good to not always be. Some dating apps also engage in sharing intimate data. And this sucks because there's even apps like Grindr admit it in a report to share information like reported HIV status and different identity categories that you were checking. They're sharing that information with advertisers and people who might target products to you, but it does have, to me, some like scary implications for who's collecting that data. I personally makes me uncomfortable. I think that that makes me sad because, we want our LGBTQ dating apps. We would hope that they might think a little bit more about stuff like that. But when we live in a system that all these companies are always just trying to find ways to generate revenue, a lot of times, if you're not paying, you are the product. I'm sure people have heard something to that variation before. So it's just good to have in mind. And just because you don't put something like your specific identity category on your profile page or something like that, that doesn't mean that you can't be open about sharing that with people in real life. There's other ways to share information about yourself that doesn't necessarily mean you have to put it right on your profile. But these are all like considerations that we take. So just some other information about why we might be using dating apps more than ever, because I forget the exact statistic, but it is a huge statistic of people who've met their significant others, their longtime partners on dating apps. Um, so there's a really huge amount of social isolation that trans people face, and other queer people as well. There's also been a decrease in what we might call third spaces for queer people. So these would be spaces where it's not work or home, it's a place where you can, you know, vibe, have a fun community. There's not a huge amount of access to places like that. I do feel lucky that where I live in the Lehigh Valley, I do feel like I have a pretty good access, but a lot of places it's hard to access a third space, especially as trans people. And so that lack of third spaces means that a lot of people have to use dating apps in order to meet people. Also, I think a lot of times people are craving validation and love, and there's nothing wrong with that. I wanted to share some of this information just because I think it's helpful for understanding like why people are using dating apps a lot. So is in-person dating safer than dating apps? Definitely not. So I wanted to provide this too because I didn't want people to be like, okay, well, the answer is I must only date in person. The answer is that we should be aware of the risks. It doesn't mean that we don't ever engage in anything that feels like there could be a slight risk to it. It just means that we make ourselves aware of potential harms. Neither is inherently better or worse. Be aware of potential vulnerabilities in each. They present different risks. And really what you should do is choose what suits you best and take some of the safety advice into mind if you're using either method. Um, I wanted to take a little bit to talk about some methods that are used to target trans people specifically online. Um, and there's not enough research done on this subject because there anecdotally are a lot of stories about people getting taken advantage of, either through some kind of sexual violence or financial abuse or stuff like that. Something that's I've heard reported a lot as things like love bombing, sometimes even in a gender affirming way. So people who maybe are trying to get money from someone will find trans people online, and say gender affirming things to them and say it over and over again, in order to earn that person's trust. Maybe that's a person who doesn't get a lot of gender affirming validation. And then that person online will use that connection that they have with that person to do things like ask for money or ask for favors that that person isn't necessarily comfortable with. But they're leveraging that love bombing, that intense affection to, um, basically abuse that trans person. Sometimes people will threaten outing of a trans person to get what they want. A lot of times people will spin like elaborate stories about needing money. A lot of times they will be preying on trans people's like generosity or desire for connection or stuff like that. And we can see this with a lot of different vulnerable groups. Another group that's really, um, has high reports of online abuse and stuff would be like disabled people, or autistic people. And there's a huge overlap between trans people, but we're both groups that oftentimes don't get a lot of validation. And so people are leveraging that, to harm people. Sometimes people will say stuff like, you're different than those other trans people. Don't tell anyone else about us. And then things like asking for sexual photos that you're not comfortable with. These things also are really common to happen to trans youth, or queer youth. Um, there are really high rates of sexual violence that happens to queer youth online. Um, and the same is true for queer adults. Uh, Really high risks of stuff like that. Um, so just some closing thoughts about the targeting us online. A lot of times we don't think that these kinds of things will happen to us. People engaging this behavior use tactics to make it seem almost okay at first. It's not like immediately the person who's abusing you will say the like wildest thing. But usually it's a series of testing boundaries until you get to the point where you're like, yes, I have to Venmo this person $500 or something like that. Um, Dating abuse tactics like emotional, financial, and sexual abuse usually are things that are like culminating into bigger acts of violence. I mean, the financial thing could start with someone being like, I just need $5 more to pay my electric bill. And this is totally different from somebody who's like genuinely your friend who know each other. I mean, friendships can sometimes have abuse elements too, but what I'm saying is this is someone randomly online who will start with a reasonable ask or start with something that's a little bit smaller and just keep wearing down any kind of boundary you might think about setting. Um, there's also increased layers of violence towards BIPOC, and disabled trans people, and increased levels of vulnerability that come with that too. And I don't say all of these things to make it seem like trans people shouldn't, enjoy ourselves online. I think it says more about the world around us than it does about us. I think that trans people should still be allowed to have fun, find love, find connection online if we want to. So I wanted to give some alternative recs for social media. Um, I do not say that any of these places are perfect, but they could be some places with some slightly less risks. Tumblr has probably the most robust non-discrimination policy than any platform that I've seen, and they do actively enforce anti-discrimination, specifically for LGBTQ plus people. Definitely doesn't have as many people as some of those other sites like Instagram or TikTok, but I've enjoyed it. Blue Sky has also gotten a lot of popularity lately. You'll notice I didn't put X on our app list. I think that X is probably best avoided unless you have to use it professionally. But Blue Sky is very, very, very similar to X. Basically, it was created with the specific aim of creating a welcoming environment and also enforces anti-discrimination policies along with specific LGBTQ plus protections. Um, Other options could be places like Discord. Eastern PA Trans Equity has a Discord, and it's a nice space that it's a server, so it's not just open social media. Discord as an entity, though, enforces anti-discrimination policies, but then you also have that added barrier of whoever moderates that server can enforce additional protections as well. The other thing, though, I would say is just because you're in like a gender affirming or trans affirming server doesn't mean that that should be just, yes, I will share all of my personal information. You can definitely know that it's definitely not as risky as like posting it on Instagram, but you should still be, thoughtful about what you share because it is online. And some discords, like there's one that's like trans people in the United States. There's like, maybe 200,000 people on there or something like that. So you don't know who all is in there. So just be thoughtful about it. So I'm going to take a pause, see if anybody else has any questions before I jump into talking about some more specific risks, talking about individuals and the government and corporations. Oh, I see Corinne put in the chat, lots of fraudsters will ask for gift cards. That is totally true. I see Aether shared recently searched someone trying to become a friend and found scary information about them from a simple Google search of first name, last name. That's a scary good thing. You did a little digging first. Yeah, for sure. It's rough out there sometimes. Aether said another recommendation for dating apps is searching someone's name on Google/background checking. It's not a bad idea. Sometimes some things will come up that are a lot. All right, folks, I'm going to jump into the knowing some of the risks section. So some of these things are a little bit repeat, so we'll move pretty quickly through them. But from individuals, other individuals online, you have some risks of identity theft, asking for money, pretending to want to give you money as well. Because sometimes someone will be like, you have won this thing. I just need your information first. Yeah, unless it I would be really wary of anybody saying that you've won something. It is usually some kind of a scam. It is very rare that anyone would win some kind of a sweepstakes. And if you really won some big thing, like they're going to contact you other ways than a messenger message. So physical violence, people can often become victims of stalking, threatening loved ones, and they can find those loved ones by connecting you through Facebook. Emotional abuse, like hateful comments, manipulation, and gaslighting, and then spreading conspiracy theories. I mean, enlisting you to spread misinformation as well. Sometimes there are accounts that are like, you have to share this information because it is so important. And sometimes people are sharing real news, but sometimes they're not. Especially with the stuff about asking for money and financial abuse, since we talked about that a little bit. Something else that I've seen around the identity theft stuff are people who make profiles that look like they're a support account for Instagram or Facebook or even TikTok, and they'll message you like, we need this information to recover your account. Facebook or Instagram will never reach out to you like that. It'll come through a much more full system kind of thing. So for individuals, honor your boundaries, get a second opinion in real life about what's going on. Sometimes we start to disregard some of the red flags. And if you like show the interaction to your friend, they'll be like, oh, yeah, that's definitely a scam. Because sometimes we can tell better from outside of ourselves. And when you're talking to people, ask yourself, what do I actually know is true about them? Because sometimes I mean, you're conditioned to just believe what people are saying about themselves, but asking yourself, what do I actually know is really true? Oh, sorry. Trust your gut. If it feels weird, it probably is. Honor your emotions you're feeling about something. And like I said, recognize trans people are vulnerable to be taken advantage of. So finding those second opinions can be really helpful. So now talking about some risks from corporations. Some websites take your information on your sexual orientation and gender identity for marketing purposes, and they're sold to additional companies as well. This is kind of really hard to avoid, but I think it's worth you thinking about what companies you're comfortable with selling your data or how you want to engage in that system. Some companies are also targeting LGBTQ plus people with anti-LGBTQ plus ads. This is something that happened to me on my YouTube just like a year ago. I kept getting like conversion therapy camp ads. Um, and I'm sure that they targeted more than just specifically queer people, but I know based on my watch history that that was probably something that company bought ads for. Like I said, YouTube and Instagram are two examples. And anti-discrimination policies are not always followed through on. I'm sure any trans person who's been online has had some sort of a uncomfortable to directly threatening kind of comment, and they're not always taken down. Um, the other thing to know is, especially when we're in an at-will state like Pennsylvania, companies can fire you for your online presence, even if it's not your fault, which is really sad. But that is just like the state of how our employment works. Um, I have had a friend of a friend who ended up getting fired for an online kerfuffle that really didn't have much to do with them, but it drew attention to a company in a way that the company didn't like. Um, the government can do things like monitoring your social media. They can track information about your politics, identity, and other information you share. And this practice is pretty largely unregulated. There's been a few court cases that kind of illustrated some different kinds of surveillance techniques that local police forces and the FBI were using, things like stingrays. A stingray is essentially like a it's like a it's like a hub where your data would get passed through. And they do, I believe, need a warrant to set up like a stingray and look for information. But at a certain point, they are holding information that is not necessarily the thing that they're looking for. So there's a lot of things happening that aren't necessarily completely regulated. Be mindful of posting images of protests of yourself and other people, especially if you're in any kind of an immigration process. Social media information can be, and we have seen it been used against people who are going through any kind of immigration process, even people who are here on like what is called like a legal status, especially if you or anyone you are close with are undocumented, being really wary of the things that you're posting about that. Based on what you post on social media, the government can also elect to surveil you more. That especially goes in line with some of the things where I was talking about jokes about political figures. From the outside, the government can't always tell if you're joking or if you actually want to do harm to someone or something like that. I'm not saying this is just, I'm just saying it happens. And so to be wary of that. So before we jump into the online, responding to online harassment and hate, does anyone have any additional questions about some of those fears? It can feel kind of scary when you're laying out a lot of risks. Um, but I also think that it's important to not disengage from understanding those risks. We live in a world that's like so hyper online that I think a lot of times the general tone is people are kind of just like, yeah, just keep moving, don't think about the things. But I think that it is good to be making active decisions about what we're sharing online. So, responding to online harassment and hate. Some unique factors that make online harassment really suck. It's often anonymous, and it can be really hard to track who exactly that person is. A lot of times you might worry it's someone in your real life or someone who's, two doors down from you or something like that. It can be really hard to assess a threat. I know as somebody who in my personal life, I write books about queer people, and there's a lot of feelings about that. And I've received threats to my life. And a lot of times my assumption is like, this is just someone who's mad in this moment and they don't have any ability to follow through on this. But it's hard to assess a threat, right? Because if somebody's saying something, you also shouldn't just completely brush it off. You don't know what they actually mean. Anonymity often emboldens people to be a little bit more outwardly bigoted. And then, of course, the methods of recourse are pretty impersonal. Like you can report a comment, but you don't see what happens with that comment. Sometimes people are also embarrassed to tell someone off the site because of the site that you're on or how you post. Um, Sometimes people dismiss online harassment as less severe than something in person, but I think it could be just as overwhelming, especially because of the volume sometimes. Don't keep online harassment to yourself, regardless of what it is. Um, Most harassment is going to stay online, but sometimes people can shift their focus into aspects of your personal life. So it's good to have people looking out for you in person and online. And also, that's somebody else who knows what you're going through. Even if it's just one comment that really hurts you or makes you feel invalidated or is hurtful towards your whole community as a trans person, like don't hold that in, let other people hear what you're going through. Don't in This is just my personal opinion, and like this is an area where I will tell you what I think you should do, and I know people might do different things, but I usually encourage people not to engage with people commenting to hurt you, because the reality is that they're just trying to get as much of your attention as possible. I personally think that I know that people like want to clap back sometimes, but usually it just devolves into like a back and forth, and then that person is taking up more of your energy and your life force. Um, I'm not saying you should never respond, but in general, I don't think that it's usually helpful, especially from like a mental health perspective. It's not your fault you get harassed. But I usually encourage people to get out of the situation as quickly as possible. So not lingering and fighting it out. I usually just say block the person and move on. Um, I think every once in a while there's an opportunity for education, but in general, it's usually a no. Like I said, block liberally, block anybody who upsets you. Um, and that's just a boundary. I think that sometimes I've heard people use language like free speech on the internet, like you're silencing that person. And what I say is like, you know, your social media page is just one aspect of yourself. If you don't want to engage in that person, that's really your choice. And take that threat seriously. Really, I don't think most threats are like someone's actually going to do something in person to you, but you should report them to both the website and then also talk to your friends and family about it. Um, if it seems something that seems like really consistent, I would really highly recommend documenting it as well, um, because then you have a paper trail, screenshots, save messages, include date and timestamps. And that's easy because like on your phone, if you take a screenshot, usually it has like the little date and time like in the upper corner. But if you don't have the date when they're happening, you can even when I'm documenting something, I generally like send myself emails because that also helps with the timestamp and stuff like that. Um, and then thinking about things like how have the comments impacted you? Who can you talk to about the emotions that you're feeling? You might have some specific friends you go to. You could go to things like a support group. Like I know that hateful comments have come up in some of the support spaces at Eastern PA before, and there's definitely places for you to process those kinds of things. Um, don't leave those to yourself. And then sometimes we might think about whether or not we want to leave a specific app. I know for me, I got a lot of things that were really harmful towards trans people specifically when I was on X, sharing some of my information as an author, and I just decided it wasn't worth it. And that's hard because social media is both a social thing, but then also a lot of people have to do it for whatever kind of business or work you do. So it's a difficult decision, but sometimes if you are considering your emotional safety and you're saying, this seems like it's doing more harm than good, you might decide to jump off of that one. Some other tips, filter out words related to what triggers you or harms you. I definitely think it's sometimes people engage in a form of self-harm in looking at stuff online. And I'll explain an example of that just so it makes a little bit more sense. Um, I'll I think that I used to often read the comments of like newspaper articles about LGBTQ plus people. Um, and I don't know if it was like super duper self-harm, but it was definitely not good for me. Because you can guarantee that on any given article, especially one from like a really big news outlet, there's going to be some like gross stuff in the comments. So sometimes filtering out words can be a good way of creating a barrier where you won't be looking at that stuff ever. If you see certain words that are often associated with people saying things that are really hurtful to trans people, you can set filters on most apps so that you just never see those comments. Um, and there's also some apps that you can use for stuff like that. There's an app called Block Party, which can basically just help you disengage with harmful people, or any additional accounts that they make. It kind of like monitors your account for you and basically like blocks people for you. And there's a few other anti-harassment apps like that. And it's sad that we have to think about stuff like that, but we really do have to think about all the different kinds of tools we can use to protect ourselves. So we've entered our Q&A portion. I really appreciate everybody's contributions. Oh, I see someone type something else. I think Al. The catfisher thought he could have intimacy with the catfishy in a foursome. It's not clear that the catfishy does or does not want to participate in that. So also this person who is trying to catfish, this person is like having some sort of a parasocial relationship. And a lot of times people will develop things like that online because this person's sharing information. And again, not his fault for sharing the information online, but sometimes social media creates a sense of intimacy and creates vulnerability because people maybe feel closer to that person than they actually are. And in that way, sometimes those conditions can lead to scenarios like this, where this person is assuming that this other person might have interest in him if he goes through backflips to try to arrange some sort of a situation. Um, it's something to be aware of. It's something to be aware of. I see Aether posts in the chat. A few other cyber safety things I've learned slash mistakes experienced through the years. If you do any gig work slash vending that requires online payment systems, Cash App will reveal your name. Oh, yep. Cash App will reveal your name, real name when a person goes to pay your cash tag. Venmo seems to be okay with using a performer name slash nickname. It will say your actual name on a sole proprietor business account. Amazon wishlist is not safe and will provide your shipping information to people buying from it, despite that not being explicitly clear. Some artists will have wish lists for supporting their brand. PayPal, despite business name, will provide your legal name to consumer. Trying to think of any others. Oh, your phone number can be searched on Facebook to locate your profile and Google as well, sometimes to locate your personal address. So be wary where you attach your phone number. Yeah, for sure. Do you have any recommendations about if you are going to meet someone from a dating app, but on your way to meet the person you notice their profile has been deleted from the dating app? Huh, that's interesting. I personally would ask them directly about it. If that was the only way we were communicating, I would not meet that person. Um, which sucks because there's a billion reasons why someone might delete a profile. But if I couldn't ask them why, I probably wouldn't meet them. Because it would definitely just like raise some red flags for me. And like I said, it could be nothing, but I might have just seen too much true crime, but I also don't want any queer people to experience some sort of like really scary situation. I always think asking the person directly about it, because if somebody's being weird, usually they'll act a little bit weird when you ask a question back to them about why they're doing something. And if they're just deleted it for like a normal reason, they'll probably not respond that weird. Regardless, I would make sure that your location is shared with somebody that you trust. And then, like usual, like you're meeting in a public location with other people around. Um, also wanted to say, Aether, that I appreciated some of your tips. That is totally true. I had that problem for a long time. I was so glad when Venmo kind of updated their whatever they do because for a long time it had my dead name as my Venmo and I couldn't change it. But the last few years I've been able to change it. So that is definitely really good information to know. Um, and if you are somebody who wants to receive like letters or anything from fans or something like that, I really recommend setting up a PO box. Doesn't mean that you can't still receive weird stuff, but at least people don't know where you live. Um, I have a PO box for like most interactions. Even with some people I know, I really only share my like personal mailing address with people who I'm like, okay, we're like pretty close now. Just because you don't want it shared a lot of places. And PO boxes aren't that expensive. I think that we pay like $70 a year for ours, which isn't nothing. Money's tight, but it can be a good investment if you do want to get stuff like packages. But I appreciate all those tips, Aether, and thank you so much for sharing them in the chat. I did also, since it's kind of related to online safety, um, want to share that some of my friends have also been talking about being worried about having their phone searched or something like that at a protest or at the border or something like that. Um, you should know that it's best practice to put a 6-digit code on your phone. Um, if not, uh, there's some precedent that the police can use your face to open your phone or use your thumbprint to open your phone in order to get in. If you have a 6-digit code, it's a little bit of a better barrier against that. If your town is small and a PO box still feels unsafe, there's online websites where you can essentially buy an online PO box without a town address that will redirect to your actual PO box. Oh, that's really cool to know. Thank you for sharing that, Ether. You could also buy a PO box in a town you don't live in. Um, there's nothing that would prevent that at like a post office, to the best of my knowledge. It would be a little inconvenient if you're driving too much, but you could definitely do something like that too. Oh, and Corinne said most UPS locations have PO box services too. So lots of options. Great. Well, I'll hang out for a few more minutes in case people have anything that comes up for you that you're curious about, you want to talk more about. Um, but I'm super grateful to share space with everybody tonight. Hope you learned a little bit about cyber safety. Um, and hope you'll come back to our next trans topics. We'll be doing this every month.